Imagine a trade pact that links China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and almost all of Southeast Asia, covering about 30% of the world's GDP and population. That agreement exists. It's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. And behind the scenes of this mega deal, one small country played an outsized role in designing the rules: Singapore. In this video, we'll examine a specific angle: how Singapore acted as a key architect and broker of RCEP, and what that reveals about its strategy as a global trade and logistics hub. RCEP's origins go back to around 2011-2012. ASEAN wanted to rationalize a messy web of bilateral free trade agreements with its dialogue partners: China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India. In November 2012, at the ASEAN Summit in Phnom Penh, leaders formally launched RCEP negotiations, with ASEAN in the driver's seat. Singapore, as one of the region's most trade-dependent economies, immediately emerged as a core advocate. According to Singapore's Ministry of Trade and Industry, trade is more than 3 times its GDP. That means the rules of regional trade aren't abstract. They directly affect jobs, investment, and the port and airport activities that define Singapore's economy. From the outset, Singapore pushed for 3 things: broad coverage of goods and services, a strong focus on rules of origin to smooth supply chains, and the inclusion of modern chapters such as e-commerce. As an ASEAN member, Singapore couldn't dictate outcomes, but it could shape agendas, draft proposals, and quietly mediate between larger economies. This was crucial because RCEP brought together countries that had never been in a single trade deal before, especially China, Japan, and South Korea, whose relations are often politically sensitive. Singaporean officials, including Trade Ministers Lim Hung Kiang and later Chan Chun Sing, repeatedly emphasized that RCEP had to be substantive and commercially meaningful. In practice, that meant pushing for tariff reductions on at least 90% of goods over time, and streamlined customs procedures that would benefit companies using Singapore as a regional distribution hub. One of Singapore's most significant contributions was in championing flexible but coherent rules of origin. Under RCEP, a product that qualifies under a single unified rule of origin can be traded across all RCEP members with preferential tariffs. For manufacturers that source parts from multiple Asian economies and ship through Singapore, this greatly reduces administrative costs compared to juggling multiple separate agreements. Singapore also used its experience from other high-standard trade deals, like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, to push RCEP incrementally forward. While RCEP standards are widely seen as more modest than CPTPPs, especially in areas like labor and environmental provisions, Singapore lobbied for inclusion of digital trade elements, such as bans on customs duties on electronic transmissions and basic protections for cross-border data flows. The negotiations were not smooth. India withdrew in 2019 over concerns about trade imbalances, particularly with China. Singapore publicly expressed hope that India might rejoin in the future, reflecting its preference for an inclusive regional architecture. Still, ASEAN and the remaining 14 countries concluded negotiations in November 2019. RCEP was signed virtually on 15 November 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic. For Singapore, that timing reinforced the message that open markets remained vital despite global disruptions. The agreement entered into force for Singapore on 1 January 2022. How does this reshape Singapore's role in global trade? First, RCEP strengthens Singapore's position as a hub for multinational companies. Firms can base regional operations in Singapore and use RCEP's unified rules of origin to design supply chains that stretch across East and Southeast Asia while enjoying lower tariffs. Second, RCEP complements rather than replaces other agreements like CPTPP and Singapore's extensive network of bilateral FTAs. This overlapping architecture allows Singapore to offer investors remarkable flexibility, access to different markets under different rule sets, but all coordinated from a politically stable and business-friendly base. Third, Singapore's role in shepherding RCEP highlights a broader strategy. It cannot rely on military or demographic weight. Instead, it invests diplomatic capital in rulemaking, whether on trade, aviation, or digital governance, so that it remains indispensable to how the region does business. In other words, RCEP is not just a trade agreement that Singapore joined. It is a concrete example of how Singapore shapes the economic order of Asia from the negotiating table. As RCEP is implemented and potentially upgraded in the years ahead, Singapore is likely to keep pushing for deeper commitments in services, investment, and digital trade, quietly but consistently. For a city-state built on connectivity, helping to write the rules of regional commerce is not optional. It's a strategic necessity. Understanding Singapore's role in RCEP shows how even small states can wield significant influence by mastering the details, building coalitions, and designing systems that others find useful enough to adopt.